Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Divide in Education. My name is Valerie, and today I'm joined with Emma and Meg, where we will be talking about digital access.
Perfect. Thanks, Valerie. So today in our podcast, we're going to be talking about digital access. We'll first go into the history of digital access, then we'll talk about digital access policy, and then we'll go into the digital access in rural areas and finish off with some case studies. So I'm going to pass it back over to Valerie to talk about the definition of digital access.
So, upon further research, we've found out that digital access is the ability to fully participate in a digital society. This includes access to tools and technologies such as the internet, computers, tablets, phones that allow full participation in the digital space. And so I wanted to ask each of us to kind of center the discussion around access. Before delving into this research, what did you believe defined student access in the school spaces and even the digital space as well? And what experiences do you have with the topic?
That's a great question, Valerie. I think before starting my research, I had a semblance of an idea of what digital access meant and what the digital divide was. So I thought it was like the ability to obtain participation in the digital world. But I didn't really have a conceived notion of how the lack of digital access varies across different geographical boundaries and how many intersections there were. What did you think about the digital access before researching, Valerie?
So I am from a rural area of California, and that's where I grew up. So I really thought about digital access as being able to afford an internet connection and a computer and having that in your home, which allowed you to participate in this digital world. I think it was heavily for me tied to socioeconomic status and where you lived within my town, how far out and how rural you actually were. And so that's was my center of focus for digital access. But I know Meg's experience is a little different, so we'll see what she thinks about the topic.
Thanks, Valerie. So, my understandings of digital access come from breaking down the term. So, when I hear the term access, it makes me think of being able to use or obtain something. And the term digital, my mind automatically just goes to anything that has to do with the internet. And also, much of my understanding about digital access comes from my experiences as a pre service teacher. So, I had the wonderful opportunities to engage in multiple clinical experiences in different schools and different communities throughout northern New Jersey. So, some of my experiences are in what I would call a suburban rural district. Median household income is about $90,000 a year. Every classroom had smart boards, had iPads, and in the year that I was there, they were switching over from iPads to Chromebooks. So this was pre-COVID. These students had this digital access to these devices pre-pandemic, and each student had headphones. Obviously, they had chargers for these Chromebooks and iPad devices, both at home and then a charging cart in the school. And this school even had the plan to invest in like a mobile media player for podcast lessons. Whereas in one of the lower income urban districts where the median household income was about $40,000 a year and there was not even air conditioning in the school, let alone smart technologies, there was really only a chalkboard and only written learning activities. So when I think of digital access, I'm thinking most specifically about devices right now. One group of students has access to them, whereas others do not. And we know that diverse methods of instruction and independent practice are what's best for students. A very common textbook that's used in teacher preparation program is Van de Waal's book about teaching math developmentally. And it's all about how diverse methods of instruction and how that is the best way to promote learning in youngsters. So for children who don't have access to devices or access to wireless connection, they're going to definitely be at a disadvantage, and there's definitely a digital divide there. Now I'd like to move the conversation into the history of digital access. So, although issues of digital access have definitely become more apparent during this COVID-19 pandemic, these issues have existed for quite some time now.
Yeah, for sure, Meg. So in 2003, a report from the US Department of Education stated that only 41% of Black and Latinx people were using a computer at home, whereas 77% of white people had computer access at home. And then just 10 years later, in 2013, another study was published about the digital divide, stating that 70% of teachers working in the highest income areas say their school does a good job providing teachers the resources and support they need to incorporate digital tools into the classroom, compared to 50% of teachers working in the lowest income areas. So we can see that over time, this digital divide has persisted and there hasn't been much improvement.
Thank you, Emma. While some policy attempts have been made since the digital boom in about the 1990s, heavily populated urban areas and distant rural populations have faced extreme difficulties in finding policies and political support to back up building better infrastructure to support their communities. And so, one thing I really wanted to walk into and talk about is the different political climates and administrations' tactics on tackling broadband access, funding computers in schools, giving chargers and digital access to specific homes, since it rides this line between being a political issue and an issue of community need. And so the first thing that kind of came to the table, which sounds really late into the digital boom, was 2015 with Obama's expansion of Connect Home. And so here, the Department of Housing and Urban Development collaborated with everyone on and us Ignite to work with private and public sector leaders to build local partnerships and gather commitments that will increase access to internet for low income Americans. Now, when I read that coming from a rural background, I always consider the question of who counts as a low income American, not the socioeconomic status, but where are they actually partnering with these organizations? I know where I live, there would have been no community organization that would have known to partner with Connect Home to get the infrastructure they needed to get Wi-Fi or even dial-up internet out to the remote hills of California. That would have been something community members would have thought was nearly impossible. But as we've moved into a new administration in the past year, we have seen a push for just a broad infrastructure plan. And Emma will walk us through what President Biden has planned to broaden our broadband in those areas.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. So, just this past year, 2021, President Biden announced a huge infrastructure plan, and he is committing a $100 billion investment into expanding internet access as part of his new infrastructure plan. So, this is obviously great news because the digital divide happens on a structural level. I guess one point that we need to be aware of is how different and diverse experiences are across America. And we have to be cognizant that one plan won't suit all needs.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think as we move forward in this discussion, and even as we critique the history of what digital access has meant in America or even internationally, we must consider that while politically schools don't have the backing from the federal government is now deciding to step in and help portions of modern education through infrastructure and digital access issues. So, one thing I really focus on when I'm just talking with my friends about any issues is whose job is it to provide access? Is it the schools? Is it the policymakers? Is it the community? Or is it some other party we haven't considered yet? So I'd love to hear your opinions on that, Meg.
Sure, Valerie. So, the teacher practitioner and the person who studies policy and also just being a member of a community makes me think that maybe it could be a combination of all three. But part of me mostly feels like it's the responsibility of the schools. We've known for a long time that schools are usually serving as the pilot light for addressing issues in society. We can refer back to Brown v. Board of Ed in 1954 and how that really served as a catalyst for a lot of issues that revolved around the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. We know that students, by nature of their state's constitution, that students are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. We typically abbreviate that as FAPE, and that's entitled to all children legally through 504. So I would say a great stepping stone would be to make it happen in schools first. But again, we can use that just as a stepping stone, because what do you do when people aren't in school, right? They need to be served as well. So maybe getting the conversation rolling in schools and then maybe passing that over to policymakers might be the move. Valerie, what do you think?
I'm really big on holding policymakers accountable, and I feel like the policy level is where the most change is going to happen within our schooling system and within the digital access debate. So, when you look at how progress is made at a political level, oftentimes we don't see progress because there has not been court cases or litigation like Brown v. Board of Education that set the standard for what our education system is supposed to be providing to our students. And since digital access has rarely come up in court cases, in policy, and even in certain schools, since they don't consider those things because there are bigger issues that the school needs to provide to serve their community, we have ignored it completely and haven't had the teeth to grab onto this issue and really fight for these students' access to even basic internet. And, it's important that we're serving students hot lunch. It's important that we're making sure that their socio emotional needs are met. But we also have to be making sure that they can be prepared to enter the workforce where a lot of us are demanded to use a computer, and that they have access to that to even explore those options. But I do agree that everyone is accountable for getting children educated and giving them access to these infrastructures. How about you, Emma? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Valerie and Meg. You've made some really good points. Like Meg mentioned, I think that I can't really say it's any one person's responsibility. I think definitely a combination is what's most practical. But when I am thinking about who is most capable to provide access to the students, to the people, I immediately go to community. I think as it stands right now, communities aren't the ones really making decisions in government, but I think they are the ones who know what their residents need, what their community needs to provide. I think especially working within a community school this past year, providing after school programming, it's clear and evident that the community members are the ones that know what they need. Like having them speak for themselves is super important, and having their individual experiences heard is what's going to move this forward. I think maybe though we should be, rather than putting the blame on communities, I think we should be shifting to having them be given power to be able to make these changes and have support. When talking about communities, it is important to note how different communities experience issues. So even when we're moving from urban to rural areas, we can see the shifted needs and how to support those areas. So in 2020, Power Musgrove and Nicholas published a paper that talked about digital access in rural America. So they stated that it's important for students to receive a stable infrastructure, supportive teachers, delegated leadership, and collaborative professional learning when providing digital access to these students. So in this study, they talked about how in 2016 to the 2017 school year in rural Florida, they took a one-on-one approach to address what students' internet and digital needs were. So they found that it was easiest for teachers to get the students to the English and language arts lesson website when using the application of individualized instruction.
Also, just being from a rural context and like reading into the study more, it's definitely apparent that distance learning, let's subtract that we've gone through this COVID-19 pandemic, that distance learning was an option given to rural students. And what teachers would really have to do is sit down with each student and their families which often reads as a little bit more of a community approach, and make sure that students knew how to take their computer home, set it up, log on to the Wi-Fi, made sure that they had enough computers for their student population that would be doing distance learning for some time. It was a lot of resource allocation and management that had to be done by principals, teachers, families, community members, and a lot of financing and all the behind the scenes work that went into making sure that those 4 needs were met. But in an international context, we see a totally different story. One of our lovely cohort mates in education policy is Peruvian. And early into the COVID-19 pandemic, she actually shared a story about how rural education in Peru has worked for years before the pandemic. And so, what's been going on in Peru and many other countries, and even New Jersey implemented this tactic for some time, is TV lessons that were pre recorded for specific grades would air on certain channels. Think of like a PBS channel all throughout the day so that students could tune in from their living room to school. And for a lot of students who were maybe taking care of younger siblings because their parents were working, or had access to maybe like a cafe with a TV or a bookstore, were able to go to these places or stay in their homes and get access to schooling. Now, it's not a perfect system. About 15% of public school students in Peru have access to a computer or even a device to view these programs. So there is still a huge deficit, but it makes the conversation of access and infrastructure take a different tone when you're looking at the community side of things and students being able to go someplace in a community room that has a TV per se versus building a whole new internet infrastructure. So I think that's something to really think about when we talk about access in a rural area.
So, on our next episode of The Digital Divide in Education, our friends Jean and Mary are going to chat more about digital literacy in the next episode of this series.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.